Jake Thompson wiped the grease from his hands with an old rag, but stopped mid-motion when he heard it again. That sound. The same haunting cry that had been echoing through the empty corridors of Nexus Orbital Station for 3 nights straight. It started around 3 in the morning like clockwork, and didn't stop until the artificial sunrise kicked in 6 hours later. The other mechanics had stopped coming to Bay 7 completely. During lunch breaks, Jake overheard them whispering about curses and bad omens. Tom, who'd worked the docks for 15 years, swore it was the ghost of a dead pilot seeking revenge. Maria claimed it was some kind of space creature that got trapped in the walls. Even the usually rational Mike refused to take repair jobs in that section anymore. They all found excuses to work elsewhere, leaving Bay 7 dark and abandoned. Jake didn't believe in ghosts or curses. He'd grown up on a farm in Montana, where strange noises usually meant a coyote got into the henhouse or a barn door came loose in the wind. There was always a logical explanation. But this sound was different from anything he'd encountered in his 5 years working on the station. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't the usual groans and hisses of an aging space station settling into its orbit. This was something alive, something in pain. The crying started as deep, guttural howls that reminded Jake of wolves baying at the moon back home. But then it would break apart into these pitiful whimpers, like a wounded animal that had given up hope. The sound would last for hours, rising and falling in waves of desperation, before finally fading away when the station's lighting system simulated dawn. It made Jake's skin crawl, but more than that, it made his heart ache. Something out there was suffering and nobody seemed to care. Station security had done 2 sweeps of the area. Both times they came back with nothing to report. Their scanners showed no life signs, no heat signatures, no biological readings whatsoever. The chief of security, a grumpy Tellarian named Grok, had basically told everyone to stop wasting his time with ghost stories. The automated sensor grid that covered every inch of the station reported everything was normal in Bay 7. But Jake trusted his own ears more than he trusted machines. On the 4th night, Jake made a decision. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He grabbed his toolkit from his locker, stuffed a portable light into his jacket pocket, and headed toward Bay 7 while everyone else was either sleeping or working in other sections. The corridors felt colder as he got closer, though that might have just been his imagination. He followed the sound, which was clearer tonight, more raw and desperate than before. The crying led him to an old cargo hauler that had been sitting in Bay 7 for months. The ship was scheduled to be broken down for scrap next week. Nobody wanted it. The previous owner had died in some kind of accident, and the insurance company just wanted it gone. The hull was dark and cold, covered in a thin layer of frost from the bay's poor temperature control. Jake climbed through the access hatch, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Inside, the ship felt like a tomb. Emergency lighting strips barely worked, casting everything in a dim red glow. Jake made his way carefully through the cargo hold, past empty containers and broken equipment, following the sound to the engine room. The temperature dropped even further here, cold enough that his fingers started going numb. He pulled out his portable light and swept it across the room. That's when he saw it. Curled up against the massive reactor housing, shaking and sobbing, was a Lupinox. Jake had seen the wolf-like aliens before. They were famous across the galaxy as warriors and fighters. Strong, proud, and fierce. They served on military ships, worked as mercenaries, and never showed weakness. But this Lupinox was nothing like the stories. This one looked like death itself. The creature's fur hung in matted clumps, falling out in patches to reveal skin stretched tight over visible ribs. Those eyes that were supposed to glow bright with warrior pride were dim and unfocused, staring at nothing. The Lupinox was crying with such complete abandon that it didn't even notice Jake standing there. Its whole body shook with each sob, and between the cries, Jake could hear it gasping for breath like someone drowning. Jake's chest tightened. He'd seen this before. Not in aliens but in people back home. His uncle Danny had looked like this after he came back from the war. His neighbor Mrs. Patterson had that same empty stare after her husband died. This wasn't physical injury. This was something deeper, something that medicine couldn't see but was just as real as a broken bone. This was a mind that had shattered, a soul that had given up. The proud warrior species, reduced to a broken creature crying alone in a frozen ship nobody cared about. Jake stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. He should probably call security. Let them handle it. This wasn't his problem. But even as he thought it, Jake knew he couldn't walk away. His mom had raised him better than that. You don't leave someone suffering no matter who or what they are. That's just not how things are done. Jake didn't approach that first night. Every instinct told him that getting too close too fast would spook the Lupinox, maybe make things worse. Instead, he backed out of the engine room quietly, leaving the way he came. His mind was racing the whole walk back to his quarters. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that broken creature shaking with sobs in the freezing dark. The next morning, Jake headed straight to the station's admin office. He told them he was doing a safety check on the old cargo hauler before it got scrapped, which wasn't exactly a lie. The clerk, a bored-looking guy named Randy, barely looked up from his screen as he gave Jake access to the ship's records. That's when Jake found the name, Voss. The ship had been registered to a Lupinox navigator named Voss about 7 months ago. Jake started asking questions around the dock, being careful not to sound too interested. He bought coffee for old Pete, who'd been managing Cargo Manifest for 20 years and knew everyone's business. Pete remembered Voss arriving on the station 6 months back. Said the Lupinox looked like he'd been through hell, could barely walk straight, kept muttering to himself. Pete had tried to help, but Voss just snarled at him and disappeared into that old ship. At lunch, Jake sat with some of the alien dock workers. A Krillian loader named Trix had actually served on ships with Lupinox crews before. When Jake mentioned Voss's name casually, Trix's antenna drooped. Everyone at the table got quiet. Trix explained what had happened, speaking in that clicking language that the station's translator barely kept up with. Voss had been a navigator on a Lupinox war fleet. One of the best, apparently. 6 months ago, his fleet got into a border conflict near the Outer Rim. The enemy used a quantum disruption weapon, something most species had banned decades ago because of how cruel it was. The weapon didn't blow up ships or kill crews quickly. Instead, it sent out waves that scrambled brain chemistry, tore apart neural pathways, basically shredded minds from the inside out. Most of Voss's crew died within minutes, their brains literally shutting down. Voss survived, but the damage was severe. He couldn't navigate anymore, couldn't think straight for more than a few minutes at a time. The neural damage caused emotional breakdowns, memory loss, and constant psychological pain. Trix said it was like having your brain on fire all the time while simultaneously being unable to control your own emotions. Here's where Jake's stomach really turned. The Lupinox didn't have any concept of mental health treatment. To them, a warrior was either functional or dead. There was no middle ground. If you couldn't fight, couldn't work, couldn't contribute, you were considered already gone. They had a word for it that the translator couldn't quite capture, but it meant something like, the dishonored dead. Warriors who still breathed but no longer mattered. Voss had been exiled from his fleet. They stripped him of his rank, took his weapons, and dropped him at the nearest station with enough credits for a few months of survival. After that, he was on his own. The Lupinox don't do therapy or counseling or any of the things humans had figured out over centuries of dealing with trauma. They just cut loose anyone who couldn't keep up. Jake spent the rest of the day digging deeper. He found out that Voss had been trying to book passage on any ship heading to the Void Reaches, a nasty stretch of space out past the frontier where navigation systems went haywire and ships vanished without a trace. Voss had been offering every credit he had left, begging captains to take him there. It wasn't hard to figure out what that meant. Voss was trying to disappear permanently, to end it where nobody would ever find the body. What made Jake even angrier was that the station authorities knew. Security Chief Grok had Voss flagged in the system as, not a threat, just ignore. The unofficial policy was to let him be. Nobody wanted to deal with a mentally damaged alien. It was easier to just let nature take its course. One less problem cluttering up their nice, clean station. Jake also learned that other aliens had been giving Voss a wide berth. Mental illness was taboo across most species, not just the Lupinox. There was this universal fear of it, like it might be contagious or like helping someone with a broken mind might somehow mark you as weak too. People crossed to the other side of the corridor when they saw Voss wandering the station. Shop owners locked their doors. Even the usually kind Tellarians wanted nothing to do with him. That night, Jake packed a bag before his shift. He grabbed one of his thermal blankets, the good one he'd brought from Earth that actually kept you warm. He filled a container with real food, not the synthetic stuff from the station cafeteria. He'd done some research on Lupinox biology during his lunch break and found out they could eat most protein-based foods that humans could. He made his way back to Bay 7 with his supplies and his toolkit. The crying had already started. Jake climbed into the cargo hauler and walked slowly to the engine room. Voss was in the same spot, curled up and sobbing. Jake didn't try to get close. He just set the blanket and food container down about 20 feet away, close enough for Voss to reach but far enough to not feel threatening. Then Jake sat down with his back against the wall, pulled out a small repair project he'd brought, a broken comm unit that needed rewiring, and started working on it. He hummed while he worked, Old songs his mother used to sing when he was a kid. Songs about rivers and mountains and home. The crying continued, but Jake didn't leave. He just sat there working on his project, humming softly, being present. Around dawn, the crying faded to exhausted silence. Jake stood up, stretched his sore back, and quietly left. Tomorrow he'd come back. And the night after that. For as long as it took. That's what you did. You didn't give up on people just because helping was hard. 2 weeks passed before Voss spoke a single word. Jake had fallen into a routine that became as natural as breathing. Every night after his shift ended, he'd stop by the station's market and pick up food. Real food, not the processed garbage from vending machines. He'd grab protein bars, dried meat, sometimes even fresh fruit when the supply ships came in. Then he'd pack his thermal blanket, a thermos of hot coffee for himself, and whatever repair project he'd saved for the evening. The walk to Bay 7 didn't feel creepy anymore. Jake actually looked forward to it. He'd climb into that cold cargo hauler, make his way to the engine room and set everything down in the usual spot. The food and blanket went about 20 feet from where Voss stayed curled up. Close enough to reach, far enough to feel safe. Then Jake would settle in with his back against the wall and start working. The crying spells had started changing. At first, they'd been constant, lasting the entire night without stopping. But slowly they began to quiet down when Jake arrived. It wasn't immediate or dramatic. Just gradual. The sobs would still come, but they'd be softer, shorter. Sometimes Voss would stop crying entirely for a few minutes, just breathing heavily in the darkness. Jake took that as progress. Jake talked while he worked. Not to Voss directly, not expecting any response. He just talked to fill the silence the way his dad used to narrate his thoughts while fixing tractors back on the farm. He'd explain what he was fixing, complain about how cheap the station bought its replacement parts, tell stories about difficult repair jobs. Nothing important. Nothing that required an answer. Just the sound of a human voice being present. He told Voss about Earth sometimes. About Montana, where the sky stretched forever and you could see more stars than you could count. About his mom's cooking, his dad's workshop, his sister's terrible singing voice. He talked about the seasons changing, something that didn't happen on a space station where everything was controlled and artificial. He figured Voss didn't care about any of it, but talking made Jake feel less like he was sitting in a tomb. The food started disappearing. That was the first real sign. Jake would come back the next night and the container would be empty, left neatly where he'd placed it. The blanket got used too. He could tell because it would be arranged differently, wrapped around the reactor housing where Voss stayed. These small things gave Jake hope. Voss was still fighting, still choosing to survive even if just barely. Then on the 14th night, as Jake was working on a particularly stubborn power coupling, he heard it. A voice. Rough and broken like gravel being dragged across metal. Why? Jake's hands froze. He looked up slowly. Voss was watching him now, those dim eyes focused for the first time. The Lupinox's voice was hoarse from disuse and crying, barely more than a whisper. Why waste time on dishonored wretch? Jake set down his soldering iron carefully. He'd been waiting for this moment but hadn't quite prepared what to say. He went with the truth, the simple honest truth that his mother had taught him. Because you're hurting and I can't just walk away from that. Voss's ears flattened against his skull, a sign of confusion that Jake had learned from his research on Lupinox body language. The alien shifted slightly, uncurling just a bit. Lupinox leave the weak. Survival of strongest. Voss's voice carried a hint of something, maybe bitterness, maybe just stating facts. You are prey species. Humans. Soft. Why care what happens to warrior? Jake had thought about this a lot over the past 2 weeks. He leaned back against the cold wall and chose his words carefully. Humans have known depression. We've dealt with trauma for thousands of years. We have people who come back from wars with mental wounds that don't show on the outside, but they're just as real as any physical injury. We've learned things about this. Hard lessons. He paused, making sure Voss was still listening. The Lupinox hadn't moved, but his eyes were locked on Jake now. We learned that healing from stuff like this isn't weakness. It's actually courage. Takes more strength to admit you need help than to pretend you're fine when you're not. Jake picked up his tools again, keeping his hands busy. And we don't leave people behind when they're down. That's just what humans do. It's kind of our thing. Over the next several nights they actually talked. Real conversations. Voss would ask questions in that rough, broken voice and Jake would answer. Jake told him about human history with mental health. About soldiers who came home from Vietnam with PTSD, unable to sleep or function. About people who fought depression so bad they couldn't get out of bed for months. About suicide hotlines and therapy and medications and support groups. He explained how humans had figured out that the brain could heal, given time and the right help. That new neural pathways could form around damaged areas. That trauma didn't have to be permanent. Voss listened with an intensity that hadn't been there before, a spark of something returning to those faded eyes. Jake told him about neurotechnology that humans had developed. Devices that could help rewire damaged neural pathways, assist with emotional regulation, help trauma victims process their experiences. It was experimental stuff, expensive and not widely available, but it worked. Jake had a friend back on Earth who specialized in this kind of treatment. You think you can fix broken mind? Voss asked one night, his voice stronger than before but still carrying doubt. Jake smiled, feeling hope for the first time since finding Voss. I think we can try. But Voss, you need to understand something important. You're not broken. You're injured. There's a big difference. Voss's head tilted slightly, processing this. Broken means unfixable, worthless, garbage. Injured means you got hurt and you need time to heal. Your people might not understand that difference, but humans do. We've spent centuries learning it. Jake met Voss's eyes directly. You're not dead. You're not dishonored. You're hurt, and hurt can heal. For the first time in 6 months, Voss felt something other than despair. It was small, barely there, but it was real. Oh, terrifying and fragile, but real. Jake spent 3 days on the comm system, calling everyone he knew back on Earth. First was his friend Beth, a neuroscientist who'd gone to college with Jake's sister. Beth worked at a research hospital in Denver, specializing in trauma treatment for veterans. When Jake explained the situation, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. You want to treat an alien with PTSD using human neurotechnology? Beth's voice crackled across the light years of distance. Jake, that's insane. We don't even know if Lupinok's brain chemistry works the same way. I know it's crazy, Jake admitted, pacing his tiny quarters. But Beth, if I don't try, this guy's going to die. He's already given up. I need your help. Beth sighed, but Jake could hear her pulling up files on her computer. All right. Send me everything you can find on Lupinok's neurology. I'll see what I can do. Over the next 2 days, Beth walked Jake through the entire setup via long-range comm. She had him acquire adaptive neural interfaces, the same devices used to treat Earth veterans with severe PTSD. The technology worked by stimulating specific areas of the brain, helping to create new neural pathways around damaged regions. It was expensive as hell, and Jake burned through his entire savings plus borrowed money from 3 different crew members to get the equipment shipped to the station on an express cargo run. The risky part was bringing Voss into his own quarters. Jake lived in a small apartment in the station's residential section. If anyone found out he was harboring an alien that security had basically written off, he could lose his job and his housing. But Jake had never been good at playing it safe when someone needed help. He cleared out his storage closet, brought in a cot, and spent a whole night converting the space into a makeshift medical bay. Getting Voss to agree to move was harder than Jake expected. The Lupinoks had spent so long hiding in that frozen cargo hauler that leaving felt impossible. But Jake was patient. He explained everything, showed Voss pictures of the neural interface, promised that he could leave anytime if it felt wrong. Finally, at 3 in the morning when the corridors were empty, Voss followed Jake through the station to his quarters. The treatment was absolutely grueling. Not just for Voss but for Jake too. Each night after his regular shift, Jake would come home exhausted, grab some food, and then spend 4 to 6 hours running therapy sessions. Voss would wear the neural interface, this web of thin sensors that wrapped around his head and connected to a control unit. Jake, following Beth's instructions through detailed notes and occasional video calls, would guide the sessions. The device sent tiny electrical pulses into specific areas of Voss's brain. It wasn't painful, but it was uncomfortable. Voss would sit there, eyes closed, while the machine worked on rebuilding what that quantum weapon had shattered. Sometimes Voss would shake. Other times he'd cry again, but different than before. These were tears of release, of trauma being processed and slowly let go. But Jake quickly realized the technology alone wasn't enough. The real healing happened in the talking. During those long sessions, while the neural interface hummed quietly, Jake would talk. He'd share stories from his own life, from people he'd known who'd fought similar battles. He told Voss about his uncle Rick, a Marine who'd done 3 tours overseas. Rick came home and couldn't handle crowds anymore, couldn't sleep without nightmares, would hit the floor whenever a car backfired. Jake's family thought he was broken forever. But Rick found a therapist, joined a support group with other veterans, and slowly put himself back together. It took years, but he made it. Now Rick ran a woodworking business and taught other veterans how to build furniture as therapy. Jake talked about his neighbor Kelly, who'd fought depression so deep that she couldn't leave her apartment for 8 months. She'd sit in the dark all day, couldn't work, couldn't eat, couldn't see any reason to keep going. But Kelly found medication that helped, started therapy, and built herself a support network. She still had bad days, but she learned to handle them. Last Jake heard, she was back in school studying to be a counselor herself. These weren't just stories. They were proof that broken minds could heal, that trauma didn't have to be permanent. Jake taught Voss breathing techniques that his sister had learned in her yoga classes. Simple stuff like counting to 4 while breathing in, holding for 4, breathing out for 4. When the bad thoughts came, Voss could use this to calm down. Jake showed him meditation basics, not the complicated spiritual stuff, just the practice of sitting quietly and letting thoughts pass without judgment. He taught Voss to recognize triggers, to understand that emotional flashbacks were just his brain trying to protect him from danger that wasn't there anymore. Bad days will still come, Jake explained one night about 2 months into treatment. I'm not going to lie to you about that. But they'll come less often. And when they do, you'll be stronger at handling them. You'll have tools. You'll know what to do. Voss began to improve in ways that surprised both of them. The crying stopped almost completely. The Lupinox started eating regular meals instead of just picking at food. He spoke more, his voice growing stronger. His eyes regained some of that glow that the warrior species was known for. Then Voss started helping Jake with repairs. At first, just handing him tools. But Jake quickly discovered that Voss had an incredible engineering mind. The Lupinox could look at a broken system and immediately understand what was wrong, could suggest solutions that Jake hadn't even considered. All that talent had been wasted, locked away by trauma. Now it was coming back. They worked side by side and purpose returned to Voss's life. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was contributing, building, fixing things. It gave him a reason to get up each day. The real turning point came 3 months into treatment. They were working on a hydraulic system in Bay 12 when a pressure line burst without warning. Jake was right in the danger zone when it happened. Those hydraulic lines carried fluid under enough pressure to cut through metal. If it hit him, Jake was dead. Voss moved with lightning speed that neither of them knew he still had. The Lupinox grabbed Jake's jacket and yanked him backward, both of them crashing to the floor as pressurized fluid sprayed where Jake had been standing just a second earlier. They lay there breathing hard, the emergency alarm screaming around them. Voss looked at his own hands, staring at them like they belonged to someone else. His reflexes had worked. His mind had processed danger and reacted in milliseconds. The warrior wasn't gone. He'd just been buried under trauma. I want to live, Voss whispered, and he sounded surprised by his own words, like hearing them out loud made them real for the first time. Jake sat up, his heart still pounding, and clapped Voss on the shoulder. Then let's make sure you do. 4 months had passed since that first night when Jake heard crying echoing through the repair bay. Now, walking through Bay 7, everything felt different. The workspace thrummed with purpose. Tools hung in their proper places. The repair benches gleamed under steady lights. And in the center of it all stood Voss, working alongside Jake as an equal partner in their new business, Thompson and Voss Repairs. The neural damage hadn't completely disappeared. Jake knew that. Voss still had rough nights where the old pain crept back in, where the darkness whispered things that made no sense. But now there were coping strategies they'd built together. There was someone to talk to when things got hard. And perhaps most importantly, there was a reason to keep pushing forward every single day. What happened next surprised everyone on the station. Word travels fast in tight spaces, and other aliens began seeking Jake and Voss out. They came quietly, almost embarrassed, admitting to struggles they'd never spoken about before. A Krillian pilot confessed to panic attacks that came without warning. A Torvan engineer described intrusive thoughts that wouldn't stop, no matter how much they tried to ignore them. These were beings from species that had never acknowledged such problems existed, yet here they were, desperate for answers. Jake and Voss recognized something important in each conversation. These struggles weren't unique. They weren't signs of weakness. They were just part of being alive, of having a complicated brain. So they started something informal, not quite a support group but close. They combined what humans had learned about psychology over centuries with the practical neurotechnology that Voss's people had developed. They listened. They offered tools. They connected others with human specialists back home through long-distance communication. Slowly, quietly, they built something that actually helped. The station noticed. The changes were subtle but real. Beings who'd been struggling alone started showing up to work with better focus. Relationships improved. People smiled more. Then everything shifted when a delegation from the Lupinox command arrived at the station. They came expecting one thing, To find Voss's body, to recover honor markings for a memorial ceremony. Their people didn't recover. Their people didn't heal from neural damage. Their culture had no framework for survival after such injury. So they came to honor the dead and process the loss. What they found instead was a working Lupinox. Scarred, yes. Still healing, absolutely. But alive, functional, standing on his feet with purpose in his movements. The shock on their faces was genuinely striking. Voss stepped forward to meet them directly. He wasn't the broken creature they'd braced themselves to find. He wasn't the warrior they'd written off. "I am not dishonored," he said, his voice steady. "I was injured and I healed. Through the human way." The delegation leader, a warrior called Tarak with patterns of old battles marking his face, studied Voss for what felt like forever. His eyes narrowed. His posture shifted. Finally he spoke, "You should be dead." "I nearly was," Voss replied. He turned slightly toward Jake. "Until a human mechanic decided I was worth saving. That I mattered enough to fight for." The discussion that followed got heated. The Lupinox had traditions spanning thousands of years. They had beliefs about strength and weakness, honor and shame. Everything Voss represented challenged those beliefs fundamentally. But Tarak listened. He asked questions. He walked through the repair bay and saw the evidence of what recovery actually looked like. Eventually, the delegation made an offer that would change everything. Return home. Teach the others. Show the broken warriors who'd been quietly exiled, the ones with neural damage, the ones who couldn't recover through traditional means, that another path existed. Show them healing through science and genuine compassion. It would completely transform Lupinox culture, if Voss had the courage to try it. The night before Voss's departure, Jake walked him to the docking bay. The Lupinox extended his arm in the traditional gesture of respect, gripping Jake's shoulder firmly. "My people believe strength means never showing weakness," Voss said quietly. "But you humans find strength in weakness. You fall and then you help each other stand again. That is real power. That is what actually matters." Jake smiled because it was true. We all break sometimes. That's not the point. The real question is what happens after. We don't leave people behind, that's what being human means. Voss's ship lifted off slowly, carrying not just a healed warrior, but an entire new idea. An idea that would ripple through an entire civilization. All because one human mechanic couldn't walk past someone crying in the dark. Jake stood there watching the ship disappear into the stars, then he turned back toward Bay 7. There was work to do. Repairs to finish. And somewhere out there, probably someone else who needed help. That was fine. Jake would be ready.